For Creamer Media's Polity, Tabi Madiba novelist William Currie discusses his book titled Seizure. Reading your novel, one gets the sense that state capture has been attempted in South Africa for centuries. Do you think South Africa is unique in this regard?
I doubt it somehow. I was just intrigued that we had a couple of examples of state capture in our history, in our colonial period. I think state capture is a phenomenon that takes place all over the world. And I guess the most common form of it these days, or in the past, has been the coup d'etat, seizing the state by force. But these instances that I look at, the 1895 Jameson Raid in South Africa, and the steps leading to the Act of Union in 1910, where effectively the white population seized the state to the detriment of everyone else, basically, seem to me particularly interesting examples that have affected the shape of where we are today in quite a tragic basis, and in a way that makes one wonder if there's something in our political DNA that makes us more susceptible to forms of state capture that we have seen in recent years.
And how would you describe your method in writing fiction around real historical events like the Jameson Raid in 1895 and the creation of the Union of South Africa in 1910?
What made me look at those periods? Well, we had in the last 5 to 10 years the Rhodes Must Fall campaign, in which students challenged the use of colonial symbols and put the issue of decolonization on the country's agenda. And then we had the spectacle of President Jacob Zuma's attempts to seize resources of the state in partnership with various other parties. And so that then made me think about these other two periods, the Jameson Raid and the Union. And my first thing was to read up the history of those periods. And the way I go about it is I have access to the UNISA library, so I go to UNISA and make use of their very extensive historical books and documents. And then I wander around in the second-hand bookshops of Johannesburg, and I come across various second-hand books that, in almost a kind of random way, that become useful or seem to be suggestive of not just the hard history, but the sort of social history of the period. And then I think about, well, how am I going to tell the story? Because there's no point in me trying to repeat it. And that then makes me think about, well, who are the interesting characters? And because Seizure is a historical novel, then I look at, well, who were the famous people, the ones who were recognized by formal histories. So in the case of the Jameson Raid, there was President Paul Kruger, Cecil Rhodes, Dr. Jameson. And in the case of the Act of Union, there was Generals Smuts and Botha, and Mahatma Gandhi was active in that period. So then I look a bit at who those people were. And then because historical novels are not just about the history, then I look to see, well, who can I find as ordinary people who are caught up in this history? And that then leads to the kind of secondary characters who, in fact, drive a lot of the narrative and the events that I kind of use in the novel. So the Jameson Raid is a kind of detective story that underlies the broader political machinations going on. In the part on the union process, there's a kind of adventure story that draws in these characters.
And talk to us more about your love for historical fiction. When and how did it begin?
Well, I enjoyed history at school. So that was, perhaps I was lucky to have history teachers who would make history alive, who would bring in original documents and newspaper cuttings and even play some of the music of a historical period. And that's partly why in Seizure I make use of the reports in newspapers, the music of the period, and those kind of ways of making what could be a very boring, dry history entertaining. And in that sense, I also like to bring in a bit of comedy, some of the absurdity of the historical moments as well.
And can you briefly take us through the character of Lozi, the philosopher and capitalist visionary?
Lozi is a Ndebele name given to Cecil Rhodes when he was involved in his project of setting up Rhodesia and engaged in quite severe conflict with the Ndebele people living in southern Rhodesia, led by Logan Guva. So essentially, he's Cecil Rhodes. He's one of the architects of the attempt to overthrow the South African Republic, which was essentially an Afrikaner republic, I suppose we would say, although in those terms everyone spoke in Dutch. And he then conspired with Dr. Jameson, who was essentially a British imperial bureaucrat, and an American mining engineer called John Hammond, who created this plot that John Hammond and the mine owners and people who were then called Uitlanders working on the mines in Johannesburg would rise up against Paul Kruger's government, and Dr. Jameson would come in from what was then Bechuanaland with an armed force to support them, and they would then install a government that would be more sensitive to the interests of mine capital, mine owners.
And talk to us more about the character of Louis, on how the British government conspired with him to deprive African people an Act of Union in 1910.
Well, this is part of why that decade was so tragic, leading from the period of the South African War, where essentially the British took over South Africa, captured the Boer republics of the Transvaal and the Free State. And what has been hidden in this history is the role that black people played on the side of the British, and that there were more than 100,000 black people involved in supporting the British war effort against the Boer republics. And there was a kind of understanding that they got involved so as to ensure their civil and political rights in the future. And not only that, there were many black farms that were seized and destroyed, and black people who went into the notorious British concentration camps, along with Boer women and children. And so I think there was a very strong feeling when there was talk of uniting the four colonies of the Transvaal, the Free State, and the Cape and the Natal colonies into a single unitary state, the Union of South Africa. That civil and political rights should be secured for not just white people, but black people in that context. And what one can see in the history is that there was some kind of collusion between the British Colonial Office and the white leaders of those four colonies to effectively disenfranchise black people. And that of state capture by a segment of the population to deny political rights to the majority. And in a sense, that is the key damaging original sin, which then leads on into segregation and apartheid for another 84 years. Until finally in 1994 we form a constitutional democracy in which it's very clear that South Africa belongs to all who live in it.
And propaganda has always been part of politics. Just in a brief summary, can you take us through the character of Spud Mulligan, where he produced a piece of fake news when he substituted his newsreel for the official one at the Wool Frames Bioscope in Maseru?
Yes, I suppose this is also thinking a bit about the present, particularly when we saw in this period of President Zuma's state capture, we saw a lot of propaganda or disinformation on social media that was clearly directed at drawing attention away to the robbery of the state underway and blaming it on white monopoly capital. And in a sense, it was just a way of explaining this little piece of virtue that even in those days there was a potential for the use of propaganda to pursue certain political aims. Don't want to give away too much about the ending of the story.
That was William Currie speaking to Creamer Media's Polity about Seizure.